Right, we're back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast, bringing you our second segment. But before we do that, I would like to ask you please to, again, like and follow the show. Subscribe, donate, gsmcpodcast.net. All of it does help. So thank you again so much for that. It is always appreciated. All right, we're going to move into our second segment here. And I previewed it before, of course. And we're going to be talking about every baseball fan's favorite guy. They all love him, Scott Boras. Every baseball fan loves Scott Boras, don't we? Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. We are not the biggest fans of Scott Boras, considering he holds up the market every year. But could times be changing? I think that's really what I want to talk about here. And now the first talking point I have for this is kind of dramatic, but I think it's kind of due in a way, and that is, have the owners finally defeated Scott Boras? Again, kind of dramatic, but what we know about Scott Boras is he puts big prices for his free agents. He doesn't panic. He always takes as long as it takes to sign. We've seen it the past few years, and we're seeing it this year now. We saw it this year with the Boras Four, two are still out there, two have signed. It's spring training still, and two are still not signed, and two others were not signed by spring training. Of course, they signed now, but still. But looking at that right now, he held out big deals this offseason for all four of these players. Two have signed, and both Chapman and Bellinger did not get the big deals that they wanted. Chapman got a 3-year deal with $54 million. That's really a 1-year deal, assuming he plays well this year and opts out. Bellinger, same thing, 3-year, $90 million deal, and he can opt out after 1 year if he plays really well. So, you're looking at Chapman and Bellinger, and both these guys were probably looking to get in the ballpark of 7-year contracts, maybe $200+ million. And instead, they got under $100 million and 3 years for both of them. Now, I think that's pretty incredible for a Scott Boras client to happen for them. What we know about Scott Boras, which is a lot, unfortunately, because the man likes to talk. He always gets what he wants. He always gets his big deals, no matter what. He get any mediocre player, probably a 5-year deal with $100 million. That's just who he is. But it's kind of been changing these past few years if you've been looking closely. He didn't get it with Chapman and Bellinger. He's probably not going to get it with Snell and Montgomery. He may get it with one of them. He might luck out in that way, but I don't think he's going to get it from Montgomery. I think he'll get it with Snell, but even if he doesn't, I wouldn't be surprised. So, yeah, I think it's really interesting to see about what's happening with Scott Boras, what does his future look like, and what is going on with his players right now. Just going back 2 off seasons as well, you had Carlos Correa, a franchise shortstop, a guy who can be a leader for a team, a guy who always plays with a chip on his shoulder, one of the better shortstops in baseball. And he was looking for, a huge deal, like a 10-year deal worth $300-something million. We had a lot of teams that were in it. We had the Cubs we had the Cubs a lot. We had the Tigers. We had some other teams as well that I can't really remember off the top of my head because it was 2 off seasons ago. And instead of him getting his huge contract from a big market team like the Yankees, like the Cubs, like the Angels even, he signs a 3-year deal with the Twins. The Twins in 3 years. So I think we were looking at okay, that's a strange miss for Boras. Maybe something was wrong with Correa. As we saw in the future, there was something wrong with Correa, and that was his ankle, considering he signed 3 separate free agent deals the next offseason because 2 teams backed away because they didn't like his ankle. So maybe that could have been it. But we're like, okay, you know what? It's fine. It's just one player. Boras always gets what he wants. Maybe just one player, didn't get it. And then you see Chapman and you see Bellinger. We're like, okay, they're waiting out for the big contract. Boras is going to get it. He'll always get it. And then we see Bellinger. He didn't get it. He got 3 years. We're like, okay, that's interesting. Boras took that. Then we see Chapman. He took the same. We're like, wow, okay. And now we're hearing with Snell and Montgomery that they're probably going to get the same thing as well. And it's, begs the question, are the owners revolting in a way against Scott Boras? And personally, I don't want to go whole conspiracy thing here, but I think they are. I think the owners have had enough with the years and years of Scott Boras, the way they've fleeced teams, the way he's, wanted so much money from teams, for players that maybe aren't worth it, and has always gotten his way. David Sampson, who's a former Marlins GM, he has a great clip from his podcast about Scott Boras, what it's like negotiating with him. Look it up. David Sampson, Scott Boras. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube or something. It's very, very informative and very, very interesting. So, yeah, I think it's worth. I think it's worth talking about, and I think it's worth wondering. Okay, has the mighty Scott Boras finally been, taken? Like, have they finally, found his Achilles heel and found the way that you can finally not get into his ways, his evil ways of Scott Boras. I do think a lot of it is the owners just getting tired of his BS and getting tired and saying, okay, if you're a Boras client, we're just not going to give you the contract you want. Again, they still got contracts. They still were notable. It's just the fact of they aren't what we're used to for Scott Boras clients. First, Correa, the 3-year deal, it was a lot for 3 years, but it still was 3 years. So, I think that you have to look at it that way, that, he still didn't get what he wanted. Then you look at Chapman, you look at Bellinger, they didn't get what they wanted either. So, yeah, it's just a really interesting conversation to have that, okay, maybe the owners are finally just tired of him. A lot of owners for the past years before that have taken him off their board, taken any client of his off the board of the free agency or even the draft. We heard stories that teams didn't want to draft Justin Verlander when he came out of the draft, even though he was the consensus number one guy, because he had Scott Boras representing him. Obviously, it worked out in the end well for the Tigers, but still, the fact that you have teams not wanting to take a generational starting pitching prospect like Verlander all these years back when he was drafted because he's really old, it kind of shows a lot about who Scott Boras is and what the reputation he has is. And I think looking at the situation he's found himself now in with the free agency he has and the lack of contracts he's gotten, I think it's fair to wonder, will this affect his clients in the future? The first one you have to look at, of course, is Juan Soto. Juan Soto is, of course, a Boras client. Obviously Juan Soto is going to get a monster contract. There's really no debate about that whatsoever. He's Juan Soto. He's one of the best players in baseball. He's like 24, 25, insane. And he's going to get a huge contract, and I think the Yankees traded for him knowing that. I think teams like the Mets, even teams like the Cubs, knew that they were going to have to give him a big contract, looking out for him. So, I definitely think you have to think of it that way. Is Juan Soto, how great he is he going to be affected next year by having Scott Boras as his agent? I still think in the end teams are going to give him a huge contract simply for the fact that he is Juan Soto. He is amazing. He is incredible. He is one of the best players in baseball at his age. But, is he going to get less than is he going to get less than he wants? Personally, I think Soto's going to get probably somewhere insane like 14 years and $600 million or something like that. But our team's going to try to use Soto as an example of, okay, Scott, players who want to get represented by Scott Boras. Even with how insane and incredible this guy is, we're still not going to pay him what he wants and what you want because he's represented by you. Because, we don't like what you were doing these years. I don't think they'll use Soto as an example because of how good he is, how generational of a player Soto is. I think the bidding war for Soto is just going to be absolutely insane. I think, personally, maybe this is New York bias as I am from New York, but I do believe in the end it'll come down to a big Yankees-Mets bidding war, and in the end Soto will decide where he wants to go from the Yankees and the Mets. And I don't think Boras, he'll be used as an example for Boras there, but looking at his other free agents, you have a guy like Alex Bregman. Bregman is 30. He's going to be 30 next year as a free agent. He's one of the best third basemen in baseball, but he's a little older. There's some questions about how third basemen age, and is he going to be the guy that people don't pay because he's represented by Boras? How is it going to affect him? What is his contract going to look like because he is represented by Scott Boras? The same thing with Pete Alonso. Pete Alonso, of course, one of the best first basemen in baseball, arguably the best pure power hitter in baseball. The Mets have kind of said it without saying it that they haven't extended him yet because he's represented by Scott Boras. And I don't know if teams are going to be willing to give Pete Alonso, a first baseman, which positions don't really, age that well, going to give him such a huge contract because he is represented by Scott Boras. And just the situation he's in with being a first baseman, struggling last year a little bit at the end. We don't know how he's going to play this year, of course, but I think you have to look at it that way, as these guys are represented by Boras, so are they going to be used as examples? Even though they're superstar players, are they going to be used as examples by teams, by organizations, by general managers, that we're done with Scott Boras, we don't want him anymore. If you're represented by him, leave him or you're not getting paid. So I think it's a really interesting conversation to have about the fact that, okay, what's going to happen with Boras clients in the future? And now, could I be overreacting to all this? Absolutely. Could it just be that teams don't want to pay Chapman and Bellinger, Snell and Montgomery because they see a lot of risk in them? Absolutely. Bellinger has a lot of risk. He didn't hit the ball very hard in his breakout season. Chapman, his hitting goes up and down. Snell, he has up and down seasons a lot. Montgomery, only kind of had his breakout season last year. But I think it's worth noting because they all are represented by Scott Boras, who is just a otherworldly figure in baseball, a guy who everyone knows. I mean, he's an agent and everyone knows who he is. That's, how notable he is. So I think it's a real conversation you have to have. Are guys in the future going to be penalized because they're represented by Boras? And what we've seen with the future, what we've seen in the past, with Correa, with Bellinger, with Chapman, these other guys still out there as well. So I think it's really interesting. We're going to see in the past few years what happens with Boras clients, what happens with Boras himself. And I think the Chapman and Bellinger signings are just in a way of, I think they're kind of showing that the owners in solidarity are kind of moving against Scott Boras, have agreed not to go after Scott Boras clients so heavily because they don't like him. And you can argue if that's right or not, but Boras has done a lot of things. So I think there's a lot of ways you can go with this argument. But yeah, it's really interesting for me to see what happens in the future with these guys, what happens because they simply are represented by Scott Boras. And again, I think it's just super, super interesting of the fact that Chapman and Bellinger, Boras wasn't able to get big contracts for them. These are the kind of guys he would feast off of in the past few years. Guys who he could prove had great seasons this year, could probably get one desperate team to overpay for them. But instead, one went back to his original team and one went back to a team that we all thought he was going to go for relatively low prices. So, yeah, baseball could be changing the way of agents and Scott Boras. So it's going to be really fun to think about in the next few years and really interesting to see. So that is our third segment here. We'll take a break, but that was our second segment. Sorry, we're going to take a break, but our third segment is going to be about wildcard teams. We'll talk more about what this means after the break. Teams that made the wildcard and how they can improve, and we'll talk about it after. So we'll see you after the break. So thanks and bye.